On this morning in 2008 in New York, Central Park was filled with people out for a walk. Mary was accompanying her friend as they read together. A gentle breeze swept by, rustling the leaves. Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the morning calm, and Mary abruptly noticed something unusual around her. The people who had been strolling in small groups seemed to freeze in place, as if someone had pressed a pause button. Everyone stood motionless where they were. A strange scent drifted on the wind, and fear slowly crept into their hearts. Mary wanted to seek comfort from her friend, but to her surprise, Claire seemed to have fallen into a hysterical state, repeatedly asking the same question as before. Then, without expression, she pulled out her hairpin and stabbed it into her own neck. Death spread like a highly contagious virus. It spread rapidly among the crowd. Starting from Jongyang Park, it gradually extended to a construction site not far from the city centre, where the foreman was chatting and laughing with his workers. A loud bang interrupted their conversation, and under the gaze of the bald opera singer, the workers on the rooftop began to fall one after another from the heights, like dumplings dropping into a pot. Moore was a science teacher at a high school in Philadelphia. Recently, the Times published a news story like this. Bees are disappearing across the country at an increasing rate. He specifically cited this news to spark the students' interest in scientific research. Without exception, the students all guessed that environmental pollution was to blame, but Moore believed it was more than that. There are still things in science that remain beyond human understanding. To conduct good research, one must learn to respect and revere nature. The tragedy in New York City has currently been officially classified as a terrorist attack. News that chemical gas may have been released in Central Park quickly spread throughout the city. Given the current grave situation, Moore's class was also suspended by the school administration. The top priority was to evacuate students and send them home, with classes to resume only after the crisis had passed. Julian was not only the school's math teacher, but also a close friend of Moore's. While everyone at the school was busy evacuating, he used mathematical analysis to confidently assert that the probability of an accident happening in Philadelphia was extremely low. However, he couldn't win against his mother's insistence, so he decided to invite Moore's family to join him in escaping to the countryside. Emma is Moore's wife, but recently there have been problems in their relationship. A man named Joey has been persistently bothering Emma, causing her a great deal of distress, though Moore remains completely unaware of this. After returning home, he urged his wife to pack their luggage, then went to the station to meet Julian. The waiting hall was packed with people, all gathered together and following the latest developments of the incident. The news reported that scientists had confirmed the toxic gas was a natural compound, and everyone listened intently. Everyone became deeply worried. The broadcast announcing the train's arrival interrupted Moore's thoughts. However, Julian had only brought his child, Jess. His wife, Yvette, was delayed on the road due to traffic, so they had no choice but to leave first. Moore and the others had just left Philadelphia when something happened. A gust of wind swept through, and the temperature suddenly dropped by several degrees. People who had just been walking suddenly froze in place, as if a pause had been pressed. The stillness in the air was first shattered by the sound of gunfire. A police officer fell to the ground. Then the handgun was passed from person to person like a relay baton, and the continuous gunshots announced that Philadelphia had already fallen under the assault of the toxic gas. News of the Philadelphia tragedy quickly reached everyone. The train car instantly erupted into chaos. People felt both relieved to have escaped disaster themselves, and yet couldn't help but fear when this catastrophe would finally end. When it sweeps across the entire country, will they still be able to survive? Fortunately, Julian was still able to contact his wife. However, due to the sudden turn of events, Yvette had no choice but to leave in a hurry, catching a ride with whoever she could. At this moment, they were on their way to Princeton. But the good times didn't last long. The train suddenly stopped in a small town in Pennsylvania. The reason was that the train crew had lost contact with the control room, and for safety reasons, they had no choice but to suspend operations temporarily. Everyone on board was thus stranded in this small place. The passengers took a break in a restaurant, while Moore busied himself trying to cheer Jess up. Suddenly, someone nearby came over to talk. The situation in Philadelphia was getting worse. The toxic gas was no longer confined to the parks, but was spreading further. A zookeeper had even used himself as food for the lions. The bloody wounds shown on the screen shocked everyone present. The latest official reports also indicated that, based on all the information from the cities, it could be inferred that this was not an attack launched by a terrorist organization. No one knew what this disaster was, but it had swept across the entire northeast region. At this moment, this small town was right at the center of the storm. The passengers instantly became restless, and uneasy staying put was no different from waiting for death. Everyone scattered in all directions like startled birds and beasts. Moore hoped that some kind-hearted people would take them along as they left. However, in the face of disaster, people only cared about saving themselves and paid no attention to the lives of others. Fortunately, a kind couple was willing to help Moore, but Julian, worried about his wife's safety, chose to take another car heading to Princeton. Before leaving, he entrusted his child to Moore, his eyes filled with reluctance. Sensing that a final farewell was imminent, the couple, who ran a flower nursery, decided to return home first to pack their belongings before setting out on their escape. Moore had no objections to this plan. While he was admiring the plants in the greenhouse, the husband, Tom, appeared behind him. Having worked with plants for many years, Tom had a perspective on the incident that was different from most people. In fact, plants are capable of responding to external stimuli, and perhaps the chemicals they release are the very culprits behind this disaster. Meanwhile, inside the car, a heavy silence prevailed. Everyone looked haggard, their faces drawn with fear and uncertainty about the future. Suddenly, a group of bodies hanging from the treetops came into view. The girls screamed in terror, the sunlight unable to dispel the gloom weighing on their hearts. Julian did his best to calm her down, while also instructing everyone to block the air vents. Yet the sound of the wind kept pouring in. It turned out that a crack had appeared in the sunroof, and that narrow beam of light that fell into their eyes was so glaring. The deadly, invisible poison gas was impossible to see or touch. But Julian knew that their journey had come to an end. The car suddenly accelerated and crashed into a tree. Under the force of the impact, their bodies were flung out the window like ragdolls. After getting out of the car, Julian picked up a shard of glass and slashed his own wrist. Meanwhile, Moore and the others were still completely unaware of what had happened. They were making their way to the map, preparing to leave the center of the accident, when they saw bodies strewn all over the ground in the distance. The sight blocked their path, meaning that the road ahead was not safe. They immediately turned around and took a smaller path to leave. However, at a fork in the road, they unexpectedly ran into people fleeing from all directions. To their dismay, they realized that the surrounding areas had all suffered misfortune and there was nowhere left to escape. At this point, John, who was from the military, stepped forward and urged everyone to stay put and wait for further instructions. To make matters worse, at this moment, Moore realized that he had lost contact with Julian for quite some time. Fortunately, a mother managed to reach her daughter in Princeton and everyone hurried over to listen in, hoping to learn about the situation there. However, luck was not on anyone's side. Through the phone call, Moore learned that Princeton had already fallen, and even the surviving girl there could not withstand the poisonous gas. Amidst the mother's cries of grief, the girl shattered the glass. She jumped out the window, and as for Julian's fate, it goes without saying. The sunlight felt warm on his body, but as Moore held Jess in his arms, all he felt inside was a chilling cold. From this day on, he had lost his best friend, and the girl had lost her father. In this vast world, there was only this lonely, helpless child left. Moore silently vowed to himself that he would take good care of Jess. So Moore quickly pulled himself together and discussed the next steps with John. In the end, they decided to split up and head west, aiming to escape to Allen County. That place was desolate and uninhabited and might be a safe haven. However, because it was so remote, there was nothing but wilderness around Allen County, so everyone had no choice but to abandon their vehicles and proceed on foot. Moore set out with a small group as the second wave. At this critical moment, Emma also decided not to hide anything anymore. She confessed to Moore that she had once had an intimate relationship with Joey, but she ended it on her own initiative soon after. However, since then, Joey had become obsessed with her. Moore was very surprised when he heard this. He had never noticed anything before. John led the main group at the front, and they trekked across the open fields as the wind suddenly picked up. The fields rose and fell in layers, rustling noisily, and a sense of unease gradually crept into Toman's heart. However, it was already too late. People began to stop one after another, and suddenly, screams of terror exploded in their ears. John shouted slogans and pulled out his pistol. One gunshot after another pierced through the wind and reached the ears of Moore and the others, making everyone feel as if they had fallen into an ice cave. Yet, the poisonous gas continued to spread. Moore recalled Toman's deduction, perhaps it was humanity that had provoked the plants. It was causing them to continuously release toxic gas, and the strong wind's role was to spread this poison. Moore finally understood that to survive, they had to outrun the wind. No sooner had he spoken than the once calm wilderness suddenly became restless. An idea struck Moore, and he instructed everyone to split up. The mountain wind swept waves of grass rolling in from the distant river. They beat against the branches and leaves, raising a howling wail, like the Grim Reaper himself, always close behind. How could human legs possibly outrun the wind? The Moors were still caught up by the pursuing wind. However, when the strong wind swept past, everyone was unharmed. Moore speculated that it might have something to do with the number of people. The fewer there were, the less they stimulated the plants. But the danger was not over yet, Val, and the others still needed to escape this land haunted by death. They hid in a villa and found the map they needed in the study. Recalling their recent ordeal, Moore knew that they had to flee to a desolate place like Allen County if they were to have any chance of survival. Strangely enough, everything inside the villa was a replica or a toy, as if it were a castle from a fairy tale completely out of place in the real world. They couldn't find any supplies there, and once everyone had gathered themselves, they set out on their escape once more. But before Moore and the others could get far, they noticed a large group of troops approaching the villa. Watching the bustling crowd, Moore felt utterly helpless. There was simply too many of them, and danger was looming close by. Sure enough, in the next moment, a man started up a lawnmower and then calmly lay down, turning into a cloud of blood mist beneath the sharp blades. However, Jess was just an 8-year-old girl, and after running around all day, she was quickly exhausted. They had to stop for a while to find some food for Jess to replenish her energy. Moore knocked on a window along the way, but the doors and windows were boarded up, and there was no response from inside for a long time. It seemed to be an abandoned house, yet through the window, a dark figure could be seen moving about inside. Moore immediately stated his purpose, but the person inside was worried they would bring poison gas. Not only did they refuse to help, but they also ordered them to leave at once. Witnessing this, the two children instantly felt their sense of justice stirred. At such a critical moment between life and death, how can you just stand by and watch someone die? Besides, all they were doing was asking for some food for the children. Ignoring Moore's attempts to stop them, they insisted on breaking the window to enter the house. The next second, an accident occurred. A gun barrel silently emerged and in an instant claimed both their lives. Snowflakes burst in the air, and the two young men did not die from the gas, but instead fell under the shotgun of their own compatriot. The air was thick with a pungent mix of gunpowder and blood, churning everyone's stomachs. Moore was overwhelmed with grief. If only he had been more forceful in stopping them, would this tragedy have been avoided. But now was not the time to mourn. They staggered as they fled into the vast open world, the glaring sun so bright it made them nearly faint. In such a wide world, where could they possibly find a safe haven? Meanwhile, the survivors in the northeast were hiding inside their houses, not daring to move a muscle. Their minds were in turmoil, filled with countless terrifying imaginings, no matter how hard they struggled. It seemed as if no one could escape this doom and misfortune, and the disaster was gradually becoming more severe. Experts estimated that, as time went on, the number of people required to trigger the toxic gas was steadily decreasing. Perhaps, at some point, even if only one person remained, he would still be afflicted by the gas. Moore and his companions knew nothing of this. They were still anxiously searching for a secluded place. At that moment, a unique old house caught their eyes. The house had been ravaged by time, its surface mottled with patches of green moss. There was no electricity connected, nor were there any traces of cars having passed by. It was as if the house were an isolated island, cut off from the world, with only birdsong and the rustling of wind through the treetops breaking the silence. Moore and his companions felt both puzzled and a little excited. However, the memory of the previous tragedy was still fresh in their minds, so they approached the house cautiously. Fortunately, the owner turned out to be an elderly lady. She received them with a fair amount of warmth. Mrs. Jones had not had contact with the outside world for a long time, so she was quite surprised by the sudden visit from the three of them. During dinner, Mrs. Jones introduced them to the house, explaining that within 100 miles, hers was the only household in the area. There was a cold storage warehouse in the backyard and a secret passage underground that led into the house so people could hear each other as if they were in the same room. The old lady then turned to ask Moore and Emma about how they fell in love. Memories of those sweet moments flooded their minds and they exchanged a smile. The gulf that had existed between them was gradually disappearing, while the aroma of bread lingered in the air, even in this time of crisis. Isn't it a kind of happiness to still have your loved one by your side? The room was instantly filled with a relaxed and cheerful atmosphere when suddenly a sharp crack shattered the joyful mood. It turned out that Jess had angered Jones by taking food without permission. Moore, who had just relaxed, immediately tensed up. This seemingly kind old lady was actually quite eccentric. Moore wanted to tell the old woman about the situation outside, but, to Moore's surprise, Jones interrupted her. He didn't want to know anything about the outside world. He just wanted to stay in this small place and spend the rest of his life alone. The atmosphere instantly dropped to freezing point. Although Jones was very angry, his kind nature made him agree to let the three stay for one more night. Perhaps due to years of reclusive living, the old woman's temperament had become extremely eccentric. While Moore and Emma were whispering to each other, she silently appeared behind them. Under the dim yellow light, her aged, expressionless face looked somewhat sinister. The soundproofing in the house was poor, and the old woman keenly picked up on the faint airflow of their hushed conversation. She suspected that Moore and the others were plotting to kill her. However, Moore found this suspicion utterly absurd. Although they didn't like the old woman, they were still grateful that she had taken them in, so how could they possibly do such a thing? Moore and the others fell into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, Moore woke up to find that Emma and the child were nowhere to be seen. As he searched for them inside the house, he accidentally entered Jones's forbidden area, where he saw an old, worn-out doll lying on the bed. Attracted by the commotion, Jones arrived, seemingly in a hysterical state, mistakenly believing that Moore was trying to steal from her. Anger filled her eyes with bloodshot veins, and her features twisted together on her wrinkled old face. The old woman turned away furiously and ordered everyone to leave. Moore tried to clear up the misunderstanding and chased after her outside, only to find that Jones was now acting very strangely. The once agitated old woman had already calmed down, standing among the wild grass, silently reciting a eulogy. Moore was horrified to notice the leaves suddenly shaking as a strong wind rose out of nowhere. It swept in like a tidal wave, accompanied by a piercing shriek that rushed straight at him, frightening Moore into quickly retreating back inside, locking the doors and windows. At that moment, however, Jones crashed headfirst through the glass window, shards embedding themselves in his flesh, and blood instantly blurred his face. The fierce wind howled through the broken window, its roar echoing through the house, startling Moore so much that he hurried into the kitchen. But just then he heard the playful laughter of Emma and Jeeves. She remembered the cold storage room Jones had mentioned earlier and realized the two of them were playing in there. She quickly reminded Emma to ensure doors and windows were tightly shut. Having witnessed companions die before her eyes, Moore felt a wave of exhaustion. Outside, the wild wind raged across open fields. Though safe indoors, her heart sank into an abyss. Jones's tragedy filled Moore with sorrow, realizing Plant's revenge grew stronger. Now, one person could trigger toxic gas release. Would there come a moment when simply being alive would cause a person to lose consciousness instantly? The thought of heading toward death, conjured by the dim, bleak scene, filled Moore with despair. Fortunately, she still had Emma's voice to comfort her. The two let go of past grievances, expressing their love. All friction and distance between them seemed swept away by the raging wind. At the end of the world, Moore only wanted to stay by Emma's side. Ignoring her attempts to stop him, he resolutely stepped outside. At that moment, all Emma wanted was to be in her lover's arms. The raging wind tossed their hair, and the roar of the storm swept past them. The violently swaying branches, as if about to be torn to shreds, played a mournful dirge for the lovers. The three of them entered the dim, damp storage room and quietly waited for death to arrive. Yet, to their surprise, nothing happened. They survived the disaster and, after returning to the city, their lives gradually returned to normal. They adopted Jess. 3 months later, Emma successfully became pregnant, and everything was steadily getting back on track. Experts on television programs shared the source of the neurotoxin, confirming that it came from certain plants. These plants have evolved, just like other living beings, and once they sense a threat, they use their own unique biochemical weapons to defend themselves against external dangers. As for why it happened in the northeastern region, experts hold a rather pessimistic view. This is only the beginning, a preliminary warning against humanity's ongoing pollution of the environment. Just when everyone thought the incident was over, tragedy struck again, in a manner eerily similar to the wailing from 3 months ago. That scream seemed to signal the start of something, and people on the street once again froze in place while the plants appeared, armed and ready. The catastrophe returned with renewed force. The Happening is a science fiction disaster film released in 2008, mainly telling the story of how the Earth's environment, humanity's home, is being increasingly destroyed, leading to a frenzied retaliation from nature against humans. To escape the disaster, Moore and his friends and family embark on a journey of survival. As for the cause of this disaster, the film never gives a definitive answer, but through a series of hints, it makes it clear that it was humans breaking the balance with nature that caused all of this. The case of bee extinction that Moore discusses in his classroom serves as the best evidence. The film masterfully builds a suspenseful and terrifying atmosphere, not by using flashy special effects, but by making use of background environmental sounds. It creates a suffocating atmosphere, and as the threat draws ever closer and the inescapable doom looms, humanity gradually heads toward extinction. The colourless, formless wind reveals itself through the swaying of plants. It is precisely in this invisible terror that the arrival of death is once again foretold. At the end of the film, disaster strikes again. Now that humanity has the experience from their previous struggle, will they be able to survive this time? You're welcome to leave your comments in the comments section.